freedom of access to the internet, that we should be guaranteed this. And I think we have to take this lesson to heart at home, because he is not following that path at home when we talk about issues of net neutrality, when we talk about something he promised before he became president, that he would keep the internet open and free. It's not the path he's going down, letting the internet, the video and telecom companies write the legislation that will privatize the internet. That is the greatest threat, I think, right now in the United States.
The thing was that two senators reintroduced the idea for internet kill switch bill on the same day that Mubarak cut the internet in Egypt. And it tells you about the disconnect between the domestic discussion about internet freedom and the aspirations for how it should be used abroad.
We want two rhetorics. We want an internationalist rhetoric and we want a nationalist rhetoric, and it is damaging not just our standing in the world in pursuing the idea of one internet, as the Secretary said. It's also potentially damaging us at home in essentially leading to a condition in which we won't enjoy the freedoms that we're actually asking of the rest of the world.
I want to just try one thing, and that is that movements, particularly those that are threatening to governments, and then the governments themselves, are going to use in their own time, in their own eras, in their own epochs, whatever tools are available to them, particularly the tools of communication, to fight their revolution and to suppress their revolution from each respective side. This has been true. You can look at it in 1789, you can look at it in this country, and you can look at it in the Soviet Union, and you can look at it in Egypt. But now we have tools that operate supersonically.
Carl, are they leveling the field between government and government?
They're changing the dynamic. It's an eternal game, and usually the suppressive force is on the wrong side.
I don't believe that states will be able to successfully titrate how early and how tightly to shut the internet down. That had Egypt gotten in the business of shutting the internet down when there was a threat of revolution, they would have been shutting it down progressively since 2004. You can't be a modern country if people can't SMS each other.
But in Egypt, isn't that what happened? They shut down the internet and they still used various sorts of communications.
Yes, and then they shut those down, and then they realized they couldn't.
Exactly.
And then they actually printed a newspaper and distributed it by hand around
If I ran a newspaper, I would be really worried because the Egyptian government shut down the internet, then they shut down mobile, then they shut down landlines, and they said to the newspapers, "You're fine."
Ultimately, it is people who make these revolutions and rebellions using any tool that they can, whether it's the satellite networks, and AlJazeera has been key in this. We haven't even talked about that. That's not the internet. That is just people finally, a global satellite network, whether or not it can be gotten AlJazeera English in the United States, which is another whole story that we should have an entire show on, because it's astounding. This kind of censorship, we have to look at it at every level and challenge it.
What has occurred that is so threatening to despots is the availability to reach so many people so quickly, and to permeate borders, and to permeate physical things that were impenetrable by airwaves. And now we have these amazing tools that up the ante.
So what we've seen in Egypt and Tunisia is this incredible complicity, if you will, between satellite television on the one hand and new media on the other hand. Is this to be applicable now in the global, maybe Arab world, Middle East, and throughout the third world?
The role of kind of corporate media, mainstream media, has to be, if it's going to be, true to the mission of journalism, which is holding power to account, actually able to kind of concentrate efforts against exactly these kind of inflection and pressure points in government and in corporations, which involve the law and involve finance, as well as involving government, and in other words, to focus and put a shoulder to the door on some of these. So I think that actually being able to do that is a really key role for the mainstream media, because mainstream media is still, respected, and it has access to government in a way that, the internet, it doesn't yet have the collective power to do some of those very kind of, labor-intensive and resource-intensive things. One thing that's very interesting to look at from the 1989 perspective is that we're now looking at a much more compressed time frame. So speed actually is of the essence. So
6 weeks in
yeah,
Tunisia?
6 weeks instead of
17 days in Tunisia?
six weeks instead of 6 months. I mean, it felt like it happened at lightning speed in 1989 in these lockdowns, and it actually took 6 months. And we're seeing that at a much greater speed now.
We know that revolutions are highly contagious events and that they spread very quickly. In 1848, we had a series of revolutions in Europe, before television and radio and Twitter, right? Again, this is not a feature of social media. This is a feature of how revolutions spread.
It was only 17 days if you discount April 6th of 2008, and if you're counting from there, it's only 2 years unless you don't pay attention to Kafaya in 2004. I mean, the public sphere, the densifying of the public sphere in advance of the revolution matters as much to whether or not an uprising turns into a revolution or not as the events on the ground. So it is the long game, the long game of the social environment of a country matters as much, and I think the effect of these tools matters as much for that question of the public sphere as it does for the theater of collapse.
So we'll agree that the marriage that's happened between social movements for social justice with social networks has reinvented Egypt as we see it today.
Why do we need
I don't know if Evgeny
why do
agrees
we
with that,
need
but-
a definitive answer to all these questions?
It's television. Let's leave it with a question.
I mean, really.
Questions, please.
Don't you think that especially younger people will always be more advanced in using technology than governments?
Well, I mean, look at Iran in 2009, right? There were plenty of young people supplied with technology, right? Again, if you have a lot of thugs out beating them up, no amount of tweeting will probably help, right? You do need other forces. You do need to have the army on your side or, some other factors. So looking at history, again, it's very useful to look at Facebook-driven revolutions which did not succeed. Again, now in Syria, we see a lot of presence on Facebook. There are a lot of Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members. They did not translate into real-world protests. What we see are only the success stories. You do not see the failures. And there are many more cases, from Belarus, where I come from, to plenty of cases in Central Asia, and many of cases in the Middle East itself.
Also, it's an uprising against, I don't even want to call it mainstream media anymore, because I don't think the mainstream media has represented the mainstream. They have state media in Egypt. In the United States, we don't have state media, but you'd have to ask, in this country, if we had state media, how would it be any different? So when you have the protests, February 15th, 2003, before the war in Iraq, right? Millions of people rocked the globe for peace right before the U.S. attacked Iraq. And yet you get, at best, a major picture on the front page of the papers. You see millions of people screaming. Most people don't identify with that. But when you hear someone talking, and when was the last time you see these grassroots activists brought into not the mainstream media, but the corporate media's halls to explain themselves, to give a face, a name? It's letting people speak for themselves instead of what we get on all of these networks. This small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong.
I want to try to come back at that for a minute. I just come from 3 hours of being on the air.